Hello, thank you for joining us for this session, Gaining Momentum on Efficiency, Next Steps in the 2021 IECC Update. I'm Connie Umfris, Communications Manager here at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear the speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know, and we will help you as we go. Please ask questions in the question pane as they come up. We will take a couple questions after each speaker. At the end of the webinar session, you will be given the opportunity to take a short survey, and you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with links to the recording and slides for this session. We will also be sending you a registration link for the next webinar in this 2021 IECC series, which is scheduled for Thursday, September 19th. Today's panel will be introduced by Amy Cortez, NBI's Program Director. Amy, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Connie, and thank you to everybody who's joined us for this webinar to learn more about the 2021 IECC updates. In the next 90 minutes, you'll hear from experts who will explain the outcomes of the recent International Code Council Committee hearings in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They'll describe the status of residential energy efficiency proposals that represent the best opportunities for achieving substantial savings in this important model energy code. As many of you know, energy code advancements are an important tool to guide improvements in the energy performance of the building stock. Code improvements are a cost-effective way to save energy and lower carbon emissions. They can lower costs for building owners and tenants who may not have as much control over their building's energy performance. This can mean lower utility bills and less risk for energy-burdened households over the long term. Advanced energy codes also send a clear signal to manufacturers to produce more efficient equipment, and they're an important way to address energy independence because buildings use about 40% of all energy and about 70% of all electricity in the United States. The IECC is one of two model energy base codes which is updated every 3 years in a year-long process. Connie, on the next slide, we can see where we are in this process. We've just had the committee action hearings in Albuquerque, and public comments are due very soon. So our last presenter will be talking more about the process, but I wanted to be sure to mention the next big deadline in this is registration of governmental member voting representatives, or GMVRs, which is slated for September 23rd. And then these registered voters will be eligible for the online voting in early November. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's panel. Eric Lacey is the chairman of the Responsible Energy Codes Alliance, a broad coalition of energy efficiency professionals, regional organizations, product and equipment manufacturers, trade associations, and environmental organizations that promote the adoption and implementation of the IECC nationwide. In his 13 years as chairman, Eric has been involved in the development of the IECC in the code development process and has been on code adoption efforts around the country. He serves as a member of the Energy Efficiency Code Council Technical Committee, which researches and develops the EECC's code change proposals for the IECC. Eric Makala is Associate Director here at New Buildings Institute. Eric has over 30 years of building energy codes experience throughout the United States as well as abroad. He supports NBI's broader engagement in code development with an emphasis on stretch codes and multifamily code adoption. Daniel Brizet is the Alliance to Save Energy's Vice President of Policy, and he leads the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition Steering Committee. Before joining the Alliance in 2015, Dan was Maryland State Energy Administration Senior Energy Policy Manager and oversaw a diverse portfolio of state energy efficiency financing initiatives. He has provided expert testimony to Congress, the Maryland General Assembly, and other regulatory agencies on energy efficiency topics. He presents at national conferences and served on a range of national committees and working groups. We're thrilled to have all three of these folks here today to explain a little bit more about this process. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric Lacey.
Thank you. As mentioned, I'm Eric Lacey, the chairman of the Responsible Energy Codes Alliance, and I got to attend the hearings in Albuquerque. And the next number of slides are going to attempt to summarize the residential proposals. Now, keep in mind there were 226 proposals that were submitted that dealt with actually 226 RE proposals, and then a bunch of commercial proposals that had a residential component. So there were a few hundred residential focused proposals, and probably 70 or 80 of them were approved. And obviously we're not going to go through every one of these one by one, but I'm going to do my best to summarize the good and the bad and the ugly. So you can advance to the next slide. The big question on everybody's mind, I think, is, well, did the committee move the needle on energy efficiency? Were there major improvements, minor improvements, and so on? And the best summary I can give in a few points here is that for the most part, there were some small to moderate improvements in energy efficiency, maybe a couple of percent. There were no major moves forward. None of the big 5 or 10% improvements that were proposed were approved. But also the committee did a good job of eliminating most of the rollbacks and recommending them for disapproval. There were several proposals that we're going to talk about that could really roll back the code to 2009 or 2006 or even less efficient, kind of turning back the clock on all the energy efficiency improvements that we've seen over the last decade. So we were relieved that some of these big rollbacks were disapproved. And so I thought about the best way to organize this, and you can move to the next slide. The best way to organize this, I think, is in terms of the number of votes that will be needed in October and November. As was mentioned earlier, there's a deadline in September to register all governmental member voting representatives, or GMVRs. And this is important. It's important because it will help us to stop the negative proposals and maybe push forward some big improvements in efficiency. So they're basically, you can consider this kind of good, better, and best. The good outcome would be stopping some of the major rollbacks. And the good news here is, for the most part, since the committee rejected them, we only need to have 1/3 + 1 votes to stop these rollbacks, because a change to the code would require, a change to the code that wasn't approved by the committee would require a 2/3 vote. So the good outcome would be, stopping these major rollbacks. A better outcome would be to maintain the improvements that the committee adopted. As I mentioned, a couple percent or so, and that would only require a simple majority. Now, the best outcome would be if we can summon 2/3 votes in favor of some of the big improvements in efficiency. And so this is how I've organized these proposals. So let's start on the next slide with the rollbacks that were disapproved by the committee. And this is very good news, by the way. In the recent past, we've started the second part of this process, going to the public comment hearing, with a handful of really big rollbacks that we've had to spend a lot of time and energy defeating because the committee had approved them. Well, these are all proposals here that the committee disapproved. Each of these would have rolled back the code some, 10 or 15 or more percent. And so we're very happy that these did not receive the endorsement of the committee, and thus we would only need a third of the votes to completely get them disapproved. Among these are the usual issues, trade-offs in the performance path that would allow builders to trade the efficiency of common equipment, heating, cooling, and air conditioning equipment, against the efficiency of the permanent thermal envelope. And these have been out of the code for a long time, since 2009, and we don't see any good reason to reintroduce them here. And the committee agreed with us several times on this. There were also several proposals that would have done the same thing with solar, and while I don't think any of us on the call is anti-solar, there's a right way and a wrong way to incorporate things like renewable energy into the code, and incorporating them in at the expense of energy efficiency is the wrong way. And again, the committee saw this and disapproved these trade-offs as well. There was also at least one package proposal that included equipment trade-offs that was RE 208. That was disapproved as well. There's another group of quite a few proposals that included sampling, where not every unit would be checked for compliance. Those were all disapproved. There were several proposals that would have eliminated or weakened trade-off backstops, which could allow you to trade away the efficiency down to unacceptable levels. And all these proposals were disapproved. And again, if we can get 1/3 of the votes to support the committee action on these, then the code will not be substantially worse than it is right now. So on the next slide is the next category of proposals, and I've added some colors here. Proposals that are colored in orange are NBI proposals. Proposals that are colored in purple are EECC proposals. And I think both NBI and EECC saw some good successes here. Again, not the big 5 and 10% improvements, but some real meaningful improvements nonetheless. And again, these are proposals that were approved or recommended for approval by the committee. And so they'll just need a simple majority of votes in the final action or public comment hearing. Among these are a lighting efficiency proposal by NBI that would improve efficiency to 65 lumens per watt. It's RE7. An improvement to fenestration U factors in climate zones 2, 3, and 4. It would also provide some space for windows in areas of high altitude and where impact rated fenestration is required to give a little more leniency on the U factor, but overall an energy efficiency improvement. RE 112 and 115 were EECC's duct proposals. One of them would require testing of all ducts, even if all the ducts are located inside conditioned space, to make sure that conditioned air is flowing to all the areas of the home. And the other one sets a mandatory trade-off maximum so that duct efficiency can be no worse than 8 CFM per square foot. So again, an effective backstop that will make sure that all the efficiency isn't traded away. There were a couple of loopholes that have been in the code for a while that EECC proposals eliminated. A loophole that would allow floors to be insulated half as much in the northernmost parts of the country. That was eliminated, and then a wall insulation loophole that should improve a lot of homes around the country. And finally, there was a solar heat gain coefficient backstop that was approved. The trade-off limit in climate zones 1 through 3 was improved from a 0.50 to a 0.40. On the next slide, there are a handful of others. There would be an HRV, heating recovery unit, required in climate zones 7 and 8, an added requirement for automated controls for exterior lighting. There'd be a change in the threshold at which replacement lighting is required to meet the code requirements, rather than kicking in at 50% replacement. Anytime you replace more than 10% of the lighting, you would need to meet the high efficacy requirements of the code. And then the mechanical ventilation efficiency and the efficiency of the equipment was improved through an NBI proposal, RE 133 and 134. On the next slide, there are a few, I think, sort of neutral proposals that we think are overall improvements in the code. The first one was an EECC proposal that would allow some amount of trading for air leakage as long as the efficiency losses are accounted for elsewhere in the building. This is similar to a compromise that was recently achieved in Maryland in their code update process. There was a tweak to the energy rating index thermal envelope backstop that allows a little bit more flexibility for builders, but it also helps ensure that the backstop keeps pace with each new iteration of the code. Rather than being fixed in time based on the 2009 IECC, it will be based as a percentage of whatever the current code requirements are. We think this is a positive change. And last but not least, there was a pretty big collaboration to reorganize the whole commercial and residential chapters to put all of the mandatory provisions in one place at the beginning of the performance path and the ERI. And these proposals were approved. Kind of the main proposal was CE 42 parts 1 and 2, and those were approved. Now, I mention this because there will be quite a bit of reconfiguration in the code, but the requirements will basically remain the same. But just keep in mind when the mandatory provisions seem to disappear from the code, they haven't disappeared, they've just moved to a new table at the beginning of the performance path and the ERI. Now, on the next slide, I want to cover some proposals that the committee approved, but that we think would be steps backwards in efficiency. And just like the previous couple of slides, these would only require a simple majority to approve or to disapprove. And so here we would need a simple majority of people to vote against them in order to keep these out of the code. Probably the biggest one is a new compliance option, RE17, which allows you to comply via a load calculation. This proposal has a number of problems. Primarily, it doesn't require compliance with any of the mandatory requirements. There's no kind of minimums for thermal envelope. We're also not sure that it's truly equivalent to the other compliance paths. And so we thought at a minimum, this thing needs to be kicked back for a little more work. In its current form, we think it would represent a rollback to the code. Probably not as big of a rollback as the equipment trade-offs, but still potentially losing a lot of energy efficiency. Again, we would need a simple majority to keep that provision out of the code. The next one was an NAHB proposal that would allow an alternative of testing duct tightness to the outdoors. This is something that we've opposed consistently for a number of years because we think it's most important that you check whether the conditioned air is actually being delivered to the rooms rather than just checking whether or not it escapes from the building. A lot of conditioned air can dump into the basement or the furnace room, for example. There's a new loophole that was introduced for wall insulation that we think is confusing at best and at worst is a pretty big step backwards in efficiency. It would allow a reduction from R20 to R18 when the studs are 24 inches on center apart from each other. And we think it's confusing and we think it could be misused and misread. There are some changes made to the performance path. One of these was a new loophole that gives credit for skylights where there's never been credit previously, and we think it would result in a net decrease in efficiency. There's also an expansion to the tropical climate zone, which allows pretty inefficient, very uncomfortable homes to be built in the tropical climate zone, and we think this is kind of a recipe for very uncomfortable occupants and likely addition of window air conditioning units later. So we are going to ask folks to vote against this one. The third category of proposals that are on the next slide were proposals that we think would improve the code substantially. The committee did not approve these, in some cases just by one vote. But we think they would bring about real energy savings and reduction of environmental impact. Of course, the top of the list here is the flex points and additional efficiency options proposals, RE206. It was EECC's, which would have required a 5% improvement. 207 was NBI's version, which would have required a 10% improvement. And RE209 actually got the most votes from the committee. It just failed by one vote. And that gives you 5 packages of measures that you could choose from. You pick one from the measures and incorporate it into the building, and you comply with the code. I suspect that one or more of these will be resubmitted in the final action. Since they were disapproved by the committee, we're going to need 2/3 votes to get them over the finish line. But out of all the proposals, these 3 proposals represent the biggest energy efficiency improvements by a long shot. And so we'd really like to see them approved. There are a number of other proposals that would have moved the needle and that still can if we get 2/3 vote. There are 4 insulation improvements, changes to the prescriptive table that would then improve all of the compliance paths, wall insulation and roof insulation, and so on. There were improvements proposed to fenestration solar heat gain coefficient that were disapproved by the committee that we'd like to see approved. There are also a number of performance path and ERI improvements. For the most part, these are tweaks to the trade-off backstops, just to make sure that that efficiency isn't traded away to nothing. We'd also like to see the energy rating index targets tightened up a little bit, just so that the code is consistently improving from one code addition to the next. Also mentioned NBI Zero Energy Appendix RE 223, and I believe, yeah, I have a slide on that later. This was narrowly disapproved as well. This would be kind of an overlay appendix built on top of the energy rating index that would get homes closer to zero energy. We thought it was a great proposal, and I suspect it will be coming back for public comment hearing. And at least on the residential side, the EV Ready proposal that was submitted by the Alliance to Save Energy and the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition was disapproved. The commercial committee thought differently of this, but at least on the residential side, it didn't have enough votes to be approved. On the next slide, just a few more details, possibly as a reminder about the big energy savers, flex points, and the additional efficiency options. RE206 and RE209 are both about a 5% efficiency improvement. RE207 is even more, it's a 10% improvement. They're designed to be kind of a standalone, scalable improvement to be put on top of a code's existing, or a jurisdiction's existing code, or as part of the 2021 IECC. On the next slide is kind of a visual summary of the insulation improvements. If all of the IECC's insulation proposals are approved, you can see almost every climate zone would see some improvement. And in most cases, these are just shifting the improvements from one climate zone into another climate zone. The next proposal has just a snippet from the NBI Residential Zero Energy Appendix. As I mentioned, it's kind of an overlay over the energy rating index. As you can see, there are more stringent ERI scores required, but also a thermal envelope trade-off backstop that would be critical to any kind of getting to zero proposal. And then the final slide that I have shows the ERI target improvements that the IECC has proposed. If they look familiar, that's because they're from the 2015 IECC. These were weakened slightly in the 2018 IECC as part of a big compromise. We think that they should be improved either to the 2015 IECC levels or something in between. So we've submitted this proposal, and we'll probably resubmit it in public comment because we think the energy rating index was never designed to stay the same over the long run. So I know I've run through these proposals very quickly, and I've only hit on a couple dozen of the 70 or 80 that were approved. If you have specific questions, feel free to submit them, and I'll do my best to answer. But at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Eric Makala to talk about the commercial side of things.
Well, actually, I do. This is Amy. I wanted to, Eric Lacey, ask you one clarifying question. You had a color coding for your proposals. Can you remind us what the different colors referred to, who originated the proposal?
Yes, and those of you who know me know I love color coding everything. The proposals marked purple are IECC proposals, and the orange are NBI proposals. Just so as you're scanning through the slides, you can see which of these were supported and proposed by these two entities.
Okay, thank you. All right, Eric, we can pass it off to you now.
Great, thank you, Amy. I guess, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect, okay. I'm Eric Makala, the Associate Director for New Buildings Institute. And as with Eric, the other Eric, we spent a lot of time in Albuquerque at the hearings, and I like statistics So it was 11 days of hearings total for residential and commercial, approximately 110 hours of testimony, and for commercial, approximately 280 code change proposals. So, and as Eric had said, part of the proposals on commercial had a part 2 that also bled into the residential. So some of the proposals were heard twice, once with the residential committee and once with the commercial committee. This was I like to look at this as kind of a perfect storm this year for commercial code development. We had several very strong pro-efficiency proposals that we feel really moved the mark. And we had a very knowledgeable code development committee with really a kind of a focus on increasing efficiency in the IECC. So we feel there was a lot of really good proposals that passed, well thought out, had a lot of good consensus within industry, especially the window industry, the opaque envelope industry, on the mechanical, and lighting. So there might have been some slight disagreements within those industries, but in general, they all came together and were able to really get behind some proposals that really, like I said, really moved the mark for from an efficiency standpoint. And Eric had mentioned about a small increase in efficiency on the residential side so far, and I think there's certainly a lot of energy left on the table that we're hoping to get in on the next round. For the commercial side, I think we actually gained a lot. I hesitate to throw out numbers, but if I had to guess, just do a ballpark savings estimate, probably about a 10% savings on commercial, but without analysis and things like that based on occupancy type, it'll be difficult to, we won't know until the dust settles. And there are, certainly right now on the commercial side, as Eric showed you, there were a lot of proposals that didn't make it in on residential. In the commercial side, we actually got a lot in that now we're going to hope that stay in through the next round of the code development cycle. So with that, Amy or Connie, can you move to the next slide, please? So some of the major changes that we saw, and I tried to, as with the residential, there were, a lot of proposals. I'm going to be hitting the high points on the commercial side too, because I don't have a total of the total number of proposals that passed, but there were several. But I'll just hit kind of the big ticket items that'll be, I think, most people will be interested in. There's a whole section on that really focuses on clarification and restructuring, and this was the SEPCAC, the IECC SEPCAC committee proposals, and we'll talk about those. Fenestration efficiency, kind of a combination of the glass industry and IECC to push forward some efficiency gains there. The opaque envelope efficiency, again, this was a lot of IECC's good work on this to actually move and advance efficiencies forward in insulation levels. Air leakage, we'll look at a few different air leakage requirements that will require testing in certain occupancies. High output water heating equipment or surface water heating equipment. So this will impact primarily multifamily construction or spaces that actually hotel, motel, places that use a lot of hot water. So there'll be good savings that way. Controlled receptacles. So this will be automatic controls on receptacles to turn the receptacles off on a scheduled basis, and probably the first proposal that got into the code over the last couple of cycles. It really focused on controlling plug loads and reducing interior loads that way. Lighting efficacy requirements, some significant changes there. Lighting power density, again, last cycle we had a drop in efficacy. We have another drop this cycle too. We'll talk about that. Probably the biggest reformatting proposal will be the C406 points options proposal, changing from a package approach down to a points approach. And again, we'll take a look at that more closely. And then a series of proposals that we classify as ready and resilient that focus on renewables. These are proposals that kind of set the framework in the IECC to bring in renewables responsibly, so that it doesn't impact the efficiency of the building, but actually adds to the overall efficiency of the building. So this is kind of our, and some of these were submitted by MBI, some of these were submitted by Solar Energy Industry Association. So there was kind of a series of proposals that went in that way. So, so we'll take a look at kind of each of these categories as we go through. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the first one, the clarification of restructuring, this was SEPCAC work, and the identical proposal went in on the residential that Eric talked about, but there's always been confusion about what the term mandatory and prescriptive mean in the energy code, and if it's prescriptive, isn't it mandatory? And so do we really need the designations on that? But mandatory comes in when you get into the performance approach, because there are some certain things that you cannot trade off in the performance approach. So what SEPCAC did a complete review of the code. They pulled all of the provisions that were truly mandatory or non-trade-offable into a table into C407. And basically said that these are the items that cannot be traded off using a performance-based approach. Prescriptive, you have to comply with them. Performance, you have to comply with them too, and anything else can be traded off. So the goal of this table is to kind of grow the table over time as people submit proposals that they feel should be mandatory. They will be designated as mandatory in this particular table. So this, we feel, and the SEPCAC committee feels, this will clarify the code, and clean up the language, and hopefully eliminate confusion. And by eliminating confusion, they'll be getting better compliance with the code and more energy savings through implementation. The next major one that I felt was a major one was actually updating the climate zones in the IECC, and this happened on the residential and commercial side. ASHRAE has their own set of climate zones that are slightly different than what was in the IECC, so those states that adopted the 2018 code IECC that referenced ASHRAE 90.1 2016 had a slightly different set of climate zones in ASHRAE than you have in the IECC. So a proposal was submitted, CE 36, that actually now it's consistent between ASHRAE and the IECC. So now the ASHRAE standard and the IECC will always be on the same set of climate zones. This does represent a slight reduction in energy efficiency across the country, but from a total consistency standpoint, this was one of the ones that was worth doing just to make sure that you could eliminate confusion within jurisdictions that might actually have two zones. For example, in northern Nevada, under the 2018 IECC, it's designated as climate zone 5, whereas under ASHRAE 90.1 it's designated as climate zone 4. So there would be confusion as far as which climate zone do you actually go with. So this was a necessary change, even though it did result in a slight reduction in efficiency. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this was a major one, and essentially there was a series of proposals that were submitted by IECC that looked at the R-value requirements and U-factor requirements in the IECC, and also did a comparison to what was currently in ASHRAE and what was coming into ASHRAE as far as the 2019 standard, and basically pick the most stringent ones. So right now, the opaque envelope requirements reflect what's in ASHRAE, and if there are requirements within the IECC that are slightly more efficient, then those are reflected in this table too. So it basically took the best of the best, if you will. And again, this represents a portion of the proposals, but not all of them. I think there were 11 proposals that didn't get represented in here, or 11 changes. So, but you can see in general there was a reduction or an increase in efficiency for, in floor insulation, for example, below grade wall insulation, unheated slabs. So again, this will go toward tightening up the building envelope and making the building envelope that much more efficient. So for the advanced cities that are looking at increasing in efficiency, this will be a good proposal to help them out. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what the next major change that came in was actually a coalition or collaboration of the window industry, which from an IECC standpoint doesn't happen often. So this was the entire window industry got together and behind one proposal to actually reduce the overall U factors of the windows for fixed and operable fenestration and for entrance doors across all climate zones. And again, this is kind of an unheard of proposal, but it does move the needle. For example, in some of the colder zones, slight decreases for example, for fixed fenestration in climate zone 5 and marine 4, from 0.38 down to 0.36. More major changes in warmer climates, down from 0.5 to 0.45, for example, for fixed fenestration for climate zone 2. So in general, these had a pretty good savings across for all U factors, and this will result in, again, a better building envelope. If we can go to the next slide, please. And then another large change was for solar heat gain coefficient. And this particular change did two things. One, it eliminated the orientation dependencies for solar heat gain from southeast and west and north. Now there's just one set of values, which actually probably will eliminate some confusion in the implementation of this particular table. We originally, when this table first came into the code, it was one set of values for all windows, and it wasn't orientation specific. And then it went to orientation specific to the southeast and west and then north, with typically the north requiring a slightly higher SHGC, a little less stringent because they realized it was on the north side. And what this proposal does is it really puts it back to it takes it one step farther and says, okay, we are going to have different values for fixed and operable, with the realization that you're going to be able to get a lower solar heat gain coefficient value with operable because there's more frame. So more frame to be able to shade the window. So there was both a reduction in SHGC, so the windows will be better from that standpoint, reflecting the fact that most commercial buildings actually have a fairly high cooling load. And then it also, again, changed the categories to fixed and operable for across the windows versus orientation specific. So this should actually increase implementation, increase some of the confusion on the site as far as what window to put where. You still will get credit for projection factors over the window, so that still has not changed. If we can go to the next slide, please. Another major change we felt was a major change in the building envelope requirements was actually required air leakage testing to meet the air barrier requirements in the code. The current structure of the code essentially says that you can either test your building or you can put in a tested materials and seal between the materials, or tested assemblies and seal between the assemblies. And there was a proposal last cycle to actually require testing. It didn't make it through. This was actually a combination of two proposals that went in. And New Buildings Institute submitted one set of proposals, or actually Northwest Energy Codes Group submitted one set of proposals, and Steve Winter Associates submitted the second set of proposals. The first set required that buildings other than Group R and Group I occupancy be tested, and there were exemptions based on building size and also occupancy types, or basic and climate zones. So there were some buildings that were exempted from that standpoint, and this was based on Pacific Northwest National Laboratory cost effectiveness analysis. So that was one set of proposals. And then the Steve Winter Associates proposals that went in actually required Group R and Group I to be tested. And whereas the other commercial would be tested at 0.4 CFM per square foot, the Group R and Group I will now be tested at 0.30 CFM per square foot. So from a commercial code standpoint, a slight tightening in the efficiency in the way that those the dwelling units are actually going to be tested. So this, again, there's been studies that show that buildings that aren't tested actually come out with a significantly higher leakage rate. So the only really real way of knowing if your building complies is to test. Again, from a cost effectiveness standpoint, not all buildings are going to be required to test, but the buildings that are not required to be tested, a new requirement came in through, again, Northwest Energy Codes Group, that will require envelope air barrier verification. So that was essentially envelope commissioning to make sure that all of the product that are installed meet the leakage rate requirements, that they're sealed between, and this will require someone to be out on site through the construction process to make sure the continuous air barrier actually is installed correctly and to code. Studies have shown that you actually do very well if you have a third party out on site actually reviewing reviewing the building as it goes up. The third party will also review the building plans to make sure that all of the product are actually called out in the construction details and the envelope requirements to make sure that they meet the code. There wasn't an exemption or an allowance put in that the building official can be the third party. And this will help more rural areas where they don't have access to this type of expertise in the field. So it was a practical modification that was submitted just again to handle more rural areas that don't have the expertise or available to them. So we feel that this will actually result in a pretty significant energy savings between the testing and the envelope air barrier verification. Yeah, if we can go to the next slide, please. So if we kind of moving away from the building envelope and into the electrical, the power and lighting power density requirements, over the last few code cycles, there has been a movement to actually figure out how do you control plug loads in the building, because this is kind of one of the untapped sources of energy efficiency. And controlled receptacles are one way that's been proven effective to be able to reduce the loads in the building, and shutting off electrical equipment that doesn't need to be run 24 hours a day, like computer systems and things like that in your buildings, or lights and things, desk lamps and that type of thing. So last couple of code cycles, there's been an attempt to get a requirement in for automatically controlling receptacles, and it was finally passed this code cycle. This particular requirement would only focus on enclosed offices, conference rooms, break rooms, coffee rooms, and classrooms. And I think there's some other occupancies that I left out of here just in the interest of fitting everything on a slide. But they're enclosed spaces that are where lights are typically left on, equipment's typically left on as people leave. So it focuses on those types of spaces within a building, and it requires that 50% of the receptacles in those spaces be automatically controlled. And so this allows whatever's connected to those to be shut off on a scheduled basis. And then in the past, there have been proposals that allowed the controlled receptacles to be spaced significantly far away from an uncontrolled receptacles. And so there were issues and complaints that, well, everyone is just going to daisy chain extension cords and things like that from the uncontrolled receptacles to where their power is. And what this is actually going to be requiring is that you actually either use a split receptacle. So the top one, for example, would be the top of the receptacle would be controlled and the bottom would be uncontrolled, or the receptacle that is controlled is no more than 12 inches away from the uncontrolled receptacle. So this will eliminate what folks have brought up as far as safety issues go, and allows the control, or requires the controlled and uncontrolled to be located fairly close to each other. So that will again, that we feel that eliminates the safety issues, and it makes this a more practical requirement. This very similar requirement is now required in the City of Seattle Energy Code, and they are getting implementation there. So again, this is one that is probably the only one right now in the code that actually focuses on plug loads and plug load control. So this, which is kind of the largest untapped source of efficiency right now for internal loads in commercial buildings. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The other big change, and a similar change again that Eric talked about, was in the residential side, was upgrading the light efficacy requirements for dwelling unit lighting in the commercial code. And currently the code references the residential requirements. This was decoupled. This particular proposal decoupled the residential requirements from the commercial requirements, so the commercial dwelling units will now have their own efficacy requirements, but hopefully they will stay consistent to make sure it'll be much easier for especially for multifamily to comply with these for low-rise multifamily and high-rise multifamily. But it does increase the lumens per watt for for lamps to 65 lumens per watt. And this reflects the sheer number of LEDs that are in the industry. And so right now, the high end, I believe, the high efficacy is somewhere around 60 to 60. I think it's 60 lumens per watt for the larger bulbs in the current 2018. This will increase it to 65 lumens. And essentially, what this does is it pushes everyone toward LED, which is the way the industry is going right now anyway. And it doesn't say you can't use compact fluorescents. You can still use them. It just eliminates some of the poor performers for CFLs. So you can still use CFL lighting. It's just it'll be some of the better CFL, the higher performing CFL lighting, or long tube fluorescent lighting, for example. But again, so we had two requirements, one for lamps and the other one for luminaires. So the luminaires are the LED integrated luminaires, where it's harder to get high efficacy lighting. So in consultation, and this actually came out of work being done in New York State, consultation with the lighting industry, 65 lumens per watt was actually selected for the integrated luminaires. So I'm sorry, 45 lumens per watt for integrated luminaires. So this still requires a high efficacy luminaire, but it'll just reflect the fact that it's more difficult to meet the 65 lumens per watt that you can for the actual lamp itself. And again, this will be required for all connected lighting or permanent lighting in dwelling units. If we can go to the next slide, please. Another major change, and there were a few different proposals that went in, was to actually reduce the lighting power density requirements, or actually not reduce the requirements, but actually make the lighting power density requirements more efficient. In the code, we've seen a reduction in LPDs over the last couple of code cycles that reflect the LED technology that's currently being used in commercial buildings and the advancement and efficacy of LED requirements. So this particular proposal, there were a few that went in, and New Buildings Institute submitted one, as did John McHugh, and as did ASHRAE. And there was a coalition coalescing around the ASHRAE proposals, which provided the largest decreases in allowed lighting power densities. Just doing a very quick calculation, if you look at the office lighting, for example, you can see office lighting went from 0.79 to 0.64 LPD, and that was about a 19% reduction in allowed lighting power density, if my calculations are correct. The other one people tend to focus on is retail at 1.06, down now to 0.84. That was roughly a 21% reduction over the current requirement in the 2018 IECC. So the efficacies of the fixtures have gotten significantly better, so the quality of light will remain the same. The foot candles will remain the same. It's just you're going to be using less power to be able to power the lights to actually achieve the same foot candle. The same foot candles that you're normally designed to. So overall, there was a reduction both in the building area method category. So the building area method again is this is one lighting power density per building type and for major occupancy buildings. If we can go to the next slide, I believe I have I'll just finish up my thought. And also the space by space approach too were reduced, reduced accordingly too, based on the lighting power density. So the space by space was actually reduced, and then that was reflected in the building area method, the lighting power density values. So the two go hand in hand. Based on the reason statement of the code, they said this was approximate 5% reduction in energy savings over the 2018 IECC. So pretty good reduction in energy savings on this particular one. If we can go to the next slide, thank you. So those were the major changes again for envelope on the lighting side. The points option, I think, this was another significant reduction in efficiency, or increase in both usability and efficiency. Their Pacific Northwest National Laboratory did some analysis about 2 years ago right now for Washington State to look at and compare the actual energy efficiency savings you get in the current points option option package format. And over the years, this first came in 2012. It was added to in 2015, and in 2018, we went from 3 options, which were mechanical lighting and renewables, to 8 options in 2018. So we continued to add more options to the options packages. PNNL did an analysis to look at to see what kind of savings there were across the different options. And what they noticed was a huge disparity in energy savings. So while we all thought that what was being submitted there were fairly close, and the original estimate in 2012 was roughly a 3 to 4% savings per option, you can see that reduced infiltration is less than 1%, whereas lighting power density in some cases, for example, in office and climate zone 4C, is over 5% savings. So the current structure of the code basically says all these are equal, but in reality, when you start doing the analysis based on climate zone, and again, this is just for office and retail, but you can see the difference in savings across climate zones and across the different the types of measures. So based on this analysis, PNNL started to look at this from a national standpoint, and we worked very closely with PNNL to develop a massive code change proposal, a massive restructure on the point savings, or shifting the platform from an options package to a points-based option. If we can go to the next slide, please. So essentially, the current structure, or the proposed structure that made it through, took each occupancy type and broke up, and each climate zone, and basically broke up, developed tables. So the left-hand column are efficiency features. Across the top is climate zone dependent, and then based on the climate zone and efficiency features and occupancy type, points are assigned based on each of the features. And so the goal on this particular, or the threshold on this, is you have to select 10 points per project. There were some divisions and splitting that were also done just to make this a little more practical method of applying the code. And there have been complaints in the past, for example, on space conditioning equipment. It was difficult in some cases to meet the current 10% reduction in efficiency efficiency for HVAC equipment, because all of the if you have a gas electric package unit, for example, both the gas side and the electric side needed to meet the requirement. So the first thing that was done was to split that, to say, you can either comply and get points by going, for example, and you see the first couple of you can have a 5% reduction in heating efficiency and get points on that on certain climate zones, or a 5% reduction in cooling efficiency, or 10% heating or 10% cooling. So essentially, if you have a packaged unit, you can comply with and get points for an increase in cooling efficiency by 10% over the minimum federal standard. You can get points that way, or you can get points by increased efficiency on the heating side for example, 10% heating increase in efficiency. So this gives you a little more flexibility. It also gives you flexibility on only going 5% above current federal minimum. Lighting power density is another. That was another change there. This is at 10% lighting power allowance, and actually within the code provision itself, it actually gives you the ability to go 10% or 11% or 12% LPA. There's a calculation methodology in there that will actually give you more points that way. You still get points for renewable dedicated outdoor air systems. So all of the typical options that were available in the options packages are still available here. They just are translated from a options format into a points-based format. There were some other ones that were actually added to this particular option. For example, enhanced lighting controls were added, or modified. That the enhanced lighting controls have already been in the code, but they were tweaked and modified to reflect better practice. Extra area daylight responsive controls. So this now has a primary area and a secondary area for daylighting responsive controls. So you actually get, you can take points for adding more daylighting in the space. Efficient equipment or kitchen equipment. This is something that has not been in the code before. And there's a realization that going to essentially an Energy Star type of commercial kitchen equipment, there's significant savings there for buildings that actually have commercial kitchens. So whether that be a fast food restaurant or normal restaurant or things like that. So you can actually get credit by putting in a more efficient kitchen equipment. So these are some of the modifications and options that were added to the points option to actually reflect increased savings and to give people more availability and more options to be able to work from it. Again, the current format right now really levels the playing field. And right now, this slide is showing Group B occupancy, but I think we have 5 different tables for 5 different occupancy types that you'll be able to use. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the next series of slides, again, the ready and resilient slides, and the focus on these slides were to, if renewables are going to be coming into the code, it's how do they come in a responsible way so they don't impact the overall efficiency of the building, but actually add to and enhance that efficiency of the building. And there were a few that were, I don't have on here, that did not pass. But one of them was actually to require solar on commercial buildings. And so that actually required a certain amount of solar on commercial buildings. This one will come back into the code, and this is very similar to the ASHRAE 90.1 provision that would also require a certain amount of solar for certain commercial buildings. The exceptions are obviously if there's not not enough roof area to meet the requirement, there are exceptions in the provision that would actually exempt a building just because of lack of roof area. So expect to see that in as a public comment. There was also a renewable definition that did get in. One of the pushes right now is to have a consistent renewable definition, renewable energy sources definition across all platforms. So that's going to be the residential, the commercial IECC, and also ASHRAE codes. And there's a push right now so that everyone is on the same page and everyone's using the same definition. And so this particular proposal did make it in. It just modified the current renewable definition that's in the commercial code right now, just to reflect the changes that essentially came out of the ASHRAE process. So that will be in there. And then last but not least, and certainly an important one that came in, was the Zero code that was submitted by Architecture 2030. And essentially this will require, this is an appendix in the code. When it is an appendix, it will require a building to hit a certain energy use index, and then you add renewables on that top of that to create a Zero code. So this, again, this will be an appendix that the American Institute of Architects submitted into the code and was accepted by the committee. So it gives a jurisdiction the option of being able to adopt the appendix as they adopt the energy code. If we can go to the next slide, please. Another major one that got in, and this is something that there was some debate on whether EV charging belongs in the energy code or not. There was an attempt last cycle to submit this, and it did not get in this time. But as Eric mentioned, there was a proposal that was submitted, two proposals on the residential side. One of the proponents, Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, that submitted a proposal into the commercial and identical one into the residential. This one was the only one that got in. This is the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, in addition to other proponents, but they were the main proponent. But essentially, this is going to require, for commercial building, a certain number of EV ready and EV capable spaces. And on the left hand side, there's some diagrams that kind of show you what EV capable versus EV ready are. So for EV capable, you need basically need to run conduit out to the particular parking space, and then you need space in the breaker box to be able to put in a 40 amp circuit. And so it's 40 amp so a 240 amp 240 circuit that'll or space for that kind of a system to be able to put in the breaker box. And you can see in this particular table, the EV capable will be required based on the number of parking spaces you have all the way. And sometimes in some cases you won't need to install this, but the more parking you have, the larger number of spaces you'll be required to put in. And essentially, putting this in during new construction is significantly cheaper than retrofitting after the fact. And given the number of electric vehicles that are currently on the road right now, with the prospect of those growing more and more, this is almost future-proofing the project. The next one then will be an EV-ready space, and the EV-ready actually requires you to run wiring in the conduit to go to the space, also have a space in your breaker box for a 40 amp circuit and overcurrent protection, and an outlet, some kind of an outlet, not the actual charging outlet, but it has to the wiring has to go into some kind of an outlet near the parking space. And you can see in this case, you'll typically be required to have fewer EV ready spaces, but still EV ready and all for all commercial building based on the number of parking spaces. This obviously does not need. If you don't have parking for your commercial building, then you will not have to be required to have this. So some street type of retail, for example, and that type of thing that don't have parking would not be required to comply with this particular requirement. So, and I think this might be the last. We can go to the next slide. Yes, it is. I'll turn it back over to you, Amy.
Sure, we did have a couple of questions come in, and one of the question was clarification on which of the commercial proposals only needed a simple majority. And I didn't know if that's easy enough for you to do at this point.
So all of the proposals that I showed right now just need a simple majority. The ones I mentioned that weren't on a slide will need a 2/3, but everything that I presented today will just need a simple majority to pass.
Okay.
Which is good news. So yeah.
Okay, great. And then there was also a request for a clarification. At one point you mentioned a 5% reduction in energy savings, and there's a question as to whether that means more or less savings.
I'm sorry. So the building will be 5% more efficient. And to be honest, I looked at that number, and this was ASHRAE submitted. This was from the ASHRAE reason statement, and I'm not sure if this was 5% overall savings for the building or 5% savings for the lighting system. And so I needed to clarify that. So as I presented that, I was in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, are we looking at just like the lighting system itself or the overall building energy savings? But that's a savings of 5%.
Okay, and then another clarification we got from our friends at Architecture 2030. They say that the zero code appendix does not require any specific EUI target, just the renewable energy, just to clarify.
Oh, okay. I must, okay.
And those are all the questions. I want to encourage folks, if you do have more questions, please add them into the question pane. There are a few more, but I'm going to move on to the next presenter who's going to talk about process. So Dan, why don't you go ahead?
Great, thanks everybody. Dan Brissett with the Alliance to Save Energy. Spent the time in Albuquerque with Eric and a lot of a big team. We had a lot of people there, and I just wanted to thank everyone for staying with us on the webinar. We've had really tremendous turnout today, and I think that's fantastic. Building energy codes are really important, and the level of interest in the webinar today is really important. You've just heard Eric talk about sort of the results of sort of how we got to where we are right now. We did pretty well in residential, and I say pretty well, even though maybe it doesn't add up to a lot of efficiency percentage improvements in energy efficiency right now. Having defeated those rollbacks and trade-offs for the most part was really helpful. And you have to also understand that the residential committee is really stacked against energy efficiency. There's a voting block of 4 home builders essentially, and so that means that you have to have 6 of the 7 remaining voters on your side. And some of the bigger high-profile proposals we had did pretty well. In fact, one of them would have the RE 209. It lost by 1 vote, which was really tremendous. And then, of course, on the commercial side, as Eric just spent a bunch of time talking about, because there was so much to talk about, we did really well. But in any case, now we're going to look forward, and thankfully, we're starting from a position of strength. I wasn't part of earlier code cycles, so I only have a positive experience. But from what I understand, the next steps that we're going to talk about in a minute are always easier when you do well at the committee action hearings. So let's move ahead to the next slide. This is a version of the slide that was presented earlier, showing the overall process of the 2021 IECC development cycle. We find ourselves sort of coming up upon 4 different deadlines, and really the process and the deadlines really drive what we're doing at any given moment in this process. So we were scurrying around to get governmental members registered to vote in March. We were working on proposals in January. We were in Albuquerque for April and May. And so it's a very deadline-driven process. And that helps us obviously figure out sort of where we need to be prioritizing efforts as we go. So the next big deadline is the submission of public comments to the International Code Council. Those are due a month from yesterday. You've heard a couple instances in Eric and Eric's presentations talking about, well, there may be a public comment here, or there may be one there. So for those proposals that weren't successful, those are the ones that will hopefully receive a public comment if they're good for energy efficiency. Largely a technical exercise. People who are weighing in on sort of the technical elements of the proposals, this is really their time to shine, because these public comments will be with us for the most part for the rest of the process. And so we're spending a lot of time right now starting to look at what wasn't approved, how we might modify it, what's the strategy, and we have a couple more weeks left to get those in. The next deadline coming up is where we sort of shift from maybe the technical piece of the process to maybe the political or the get out the vote elements of the process. By the end of March 29th, that was the deadline for governmental members to register with the International Code Council. Governmental members are the entities that belong to ICC. There are jurisdictions that are involved in code development or enforcement or adoption or training process. Now, coming up to the September 23rd deadline, that deadline is when the governmental members, which are the agencies, the units of government for the most part, it's when they have to assign their voting representatives, the actual human beings that will be participating in the rest of the process. They have to be added into the system. And I think it actually is adding to the system. They go online and they enter the names of the people. Now, for smaller jurisdictions, we're talking about 4 governmental representatives. For medium-sized jurisdictions, we're talking about 8 voting representatives. And then for larger jurisdictions, which are 150,000 people or more, they get 12 voting representatives per ICC member. And jurisdictions are allowed to have multiple memberships, and there are some really good cases of multiple memberships on the East Coast, West Coast, and in between. That's really important because March sort of set the ceiling for how many potential votes could be coming in to the process. And now September 23rd is where we have to maximize the actual voting representatives who are named and who are willing to participate in the process and vote according, hopefully, with energy efficiency in mind, and vote in a way that advances the policy priorities of the local government. So that's where that's sort of the next big deadline after the public comments are due. And we'll be spending a lot of time in outreach and working with other groups to make sure that everyone understands the opportunity and the importance of that deadline. Moving on, then we come to the public comment hearings. Oops, I'm sorry, moving on, not in a slide way, but in a train of thought way, sorry. We have the October 23rd through the 30th, we have the public comment hearings. They will be in Las Vegas, which is great. From what I've heard, better lunch options than Albuquerque, although I did pretty well in Albuquerque. This is when stakeholders, code officials, others descend on the International Code Council once again, and we will be sorting out the final slate of proposals for what comes next, the online vote. Having really quality public comments is critical here. I'm 100% confident in IECC's and the alliances and NBI's ability to put the best possible public comments together. And what we'll need to do here is marshal support from stakeholders across the spectrum to testify in support of these proposals. Unlike at the committee action hearings where the audience was a committee, now we'll be talking to the people who will actually be casting the votes. And so having a good diverse set of witnesses and experts available at hand during these hearings will be critical. This is also the first time in the process when votes will actually be counted. You can cast votes in person, and they'll be made public, which is an important indicator, and then they'll be added to the cumulative total from what comes next, and that's the online vote. For about a 2-week period in November, IECC will open an online voting period. This is when all of the voting representatives of the governmental members will be able to log in, spend time, depending on how many proposals you're going to vote for, and cast their votes for good energy efficiency proposals. This set of activities is largely around technical assistance, making sure everyone understands the timing, helping with the voting guide that we're set to prepare. But this is really where this is where the process concludes. And so a positive outcome in the online voting period means that we've gotten closer to our goal of putting energy efficiency on a glide path to net zero. And hopefully in the near term, achieving a pretty significant increase in energy efficiency in the 2021 IECC. So the next slide. We know that this is a lot. Not everyone is able to participate deeply in the process. And so what we've tried to do at the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition is to compile a helpful and useful set of online resources. There's a link here, energyefficientcodes.org. This is the IECC's new website. It has everything you need to know. It has a calculator that helps jurisdictions estimate carbon emission reductions from an update to the code, news, blog posts, not just from IECC, but also from the Alliance and NBI and Natural Resources Defense Council and ACEEE and other organizations that we're working with. Lots and lots of fact sheets, sign-up forms if you want to learn more information and receive updates throughout the process. And then as we get a little bit closer, there'll be additional links with deadlines and registration forms for the voting representatives. And of course, last but not least, critically important, the IECC voting guide to help jurisdictions understand what their votes will mean for energy efficiency in the code. So I encourage you, if you haven't yet, I encourage you to check out the website. It's a great resource, and I think it's one that everyone will find helpful. And then my last slide, I think, is a sneak peek of what's happening in Honolulu right now. My colleague, Bill Fay, who has worked with the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition for a number of code cycles and is our campaign director, he is spending his day today, and actually the last couple days, and looking forward a few more days, in Honolulu. Don't get too jealous. Apparently it's rainy there today, so it's not like he's on the beach. This is where the U.S. Conference of Mayors is gathering for their annual meeting. and for a number of cycles, IECC development cycles, the U.S. Conference of Mayors has endorsed a resolution drafted and lobbied for by the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition at the conference that clearly states the importance of building energy codes to mayors, and specifically, recently, how building energy codes can contribute to climate goals. So the proposal, the resolution will be endorsed at the end of the week. In the past, it's been endorsed unanimously. We're all hopeful that that's the direction it once again takes. It helps when your sponsor is the host mayor, Kirk Caldwell of Honolulu, and we're looking forward to this. This is an important endorsement. People pay attention to what the U.S. Conference of Mayors has to say, and of course, the city level of government is where so much is happening right now in climate policy and energy efficiency policy and buildings policy in general. And so we're proud of this track record of this relationship with the Conference of Mayors. And we're hoping that it gives us a boost as we go into these last couple phases, last couple steps of the process. And with that, I will be very happy to conclude. I think the last slide has my email address on it. You're welcome to be in touch. And again, please feel free to visit energyefficientcodes.org. And if there are any questions directed to me, I'm happy to help answer. Thanks.
Great. Well, we do have a couple questions. So one is, where and when can we get a list of which proposals will be voted on?
This is Eric Lacey. I guess I could try to answer that. The next deadline that was mentioned was the July 24th deadline for submitting public comments. And all those public comments will get taken in by IECC and published, I believe, at the beginning of September. And that's when we'll have a complete list of all the proposals that could receive a vote. That date is September 4th. Between September 4th and when the hearings begin on October 22nd, the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition will be putting out a summary of issues similar to the voting guides that we put out for the committee action hearings. The voting guides this fall will include a summary of the proposal, a summary of public comments, and which, if any, of the public comments should be adopted, and which way we're recommending that folks vote on every one of the proposals that will be heard. So keep your eye open, probably toward the end of September, early October. I'm positive that these recommendations will be on the IECC website at that time, and that should give you a good sense of which proposals are going to improve energy efficiency and which are not going to. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. Another question is that there was some confusion on the voting and what percentage of votes would be needed to prevent rollbacks in efficiency. Can you talk about the 2/3 or simple majority voting?
Yeah, this is Eric Lacey again, and maybe the confusion was in my part of the presentation. It is confusing. Generally, when the committee recommends approval of a proposal, it only takes a simple majority to finalize that recommendation or to get that change made to the 2021 IECC. And that simple majority would apply to positive and negative proposals that are approved by the committee. If the committee recommends disapproval of anything, it takes 2/3 to get it approved. And so in my presentation, I tried to kind of sort those out according to how many votes it would take to get a good outcome. And in most cases, to stop rollbacks from the code, as long as we have a simple majority, we should be able to stop any negative things from happening in the 2021 IECC. And we might even get some improvements with a simple majority. To get the big 5 or 10% improvements, we'll probably need a 2/3 majority. Hope that clarifies it.
Great, thank you. We have had a number of questions about the slides and whether the slides from today will be made available. And I want to confirm that yes, not only will we send you a copy of the slide deck from today, but we'll also send you a link to the recording. So if you have colleagues or you know of people who also might be interested, they still are able to watch the webinar today, and everyone will have access to the slides. Okay, Dan, the question is, do you know where we can find more specific information on the mayor's resolution being introduced by Honolulu's Mayor Caldwell?
Yes, the draft resolution is available at the Conference of Mayors website. Let me look up the, it's something that would be happy to send around a link to you, Connie, and Amy, for including in the email that goes out tomorrow. But if you go to the Conference of Mayors website, it's right on the front page. There's a link to all of the resolutions. It's literally right in the middle of the page. If you click on energy, it is the what number is it? It is number 59. But I'll send a link.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
There was actually another comment about, and maybe one of you can elaborate a little bit on the fact that sometimes jurisdictions will have multiple agencies that are registered as ICC members. So, so what happens to the number of votes whenever that is the case?
This is Dan. I'll answer this one, and others are welcome to join in. Essentially, they multiply. So a jurisdiction, let's say, actually, let's use the city of Boston, for example. One of the city councilmen in Boston actually put a video on YouTube about how to register as a governmental member. That's how much of a priority this was for the city of Boston. Boston's a big city. It's got more than 150,000 people. So that means every governmental member that is registered with ICC from Boston gets 12 votes. So they registered multiple memberships, and you can imagine that at 12 votes a pop, getting 5 or 6 all of a sudden means that jurisdiction has a lot of influence. But it's critical that those voting representatives actually do the voting. So that's why we're going to be putting so much emphasis on making sure that everyone is logged into the system, everyone's name is written down, everyone's affiliation is written down, everyone has the voting guide, everyone understands sort of the policy of the jurisdiction to guide the votes. And then when the online vote actually happens, gathering together perhaps, or individually sitting down, logging in, going through the votes, the voting guide that Eric Lacey was discussing earlier. Not everyone will have to go through and vote on every one of them. So we'll be working with jurisdictions who maybe want to prioritize, maybe the top number of votes that they want to cast, because it is a lift and it's a time commitment, but it's really important that everyone do it. But yes, they multiply as they go up.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have. I just want to direct people to the resources that we have listed on this last slide and remind you that we'll have the next update on the next step in the process, which will be much closer. We'll be approaching the actual votes, and we'll have a little bit more detail on that. That's scheduled for September 19th. So we hope that you'll be able to join us then as well. And thanks to all of you for sticking it out and participating in the webinar today. Thanks to all of our presenters as well for all the good information about this 2021 IECC update. All right, and with that, everybody have